Above any other settings like shutter speed, ISO and aperture, and regardless of what camera brand you use, the one thing that will most greatly affect the final look of your images is the focal length you shoot with. Considering what type of subject you're trying to capture and what kind of images you want to create, making the right decision when it comes to picking a focal length is crucial. In this video I want to discuss the strengths and limitations of each focal length, showing plenty of images and tell you more about which one I prefer depending on the light and location. All that to hopefully help you decide which focal length you want to try out or which one you want to commit to for a long period of time. At the end I will also address burning questions like cropping versus zooming, APS-C versus full frame and zoom versus prime. My name is Adrian Sanganetti. I'm a street and travel photographer based in Hiroshima, Japan, and today we are talking focal lengths. Starting with ultra-wide focal lengths at 24mm and below, and honestly I almost never use them, so I don't have a lot of insight. It is wide, very wide, good for landscape and architecture, but also useful when you're in tighter spaces, making them look bigger than they are, or when walking in a forest or a market. It comes with a lot of distortion, so you have to be careful when placing elements or people close to the edges of the frame. Things can start to look funny in a bad way pretty quickly. I think these ultra-wide focal lengths work well when you have interesting skies or when you are shooting around sunrise or sunset, but they can create way too much negative space when it's overcast, resulting in a huge portion of the frame covered by low texture grey clouds. It's also very difficult to come up with a clean composition unless you find yourself in a very open, minimalistic environment. I personally have never owned a prime lens of any of these focal lengths. I only shoot at 24mm when I'm using my big 24-70 zoom, which is almost never because of how heavy it is. It's really not the look I'm drawn to, and it's not the look that makes me stop scrolling. I'm not a big fan of the unrealistic feel that comes with such wide-angle lenses. It works well in picturesque locations, but maybe I'm more attracted to the act of making everyday scenes look great than taking wide shots of the craziest mountain with a sunset. Next is 28mm, which is dear to my heart. It is a very immersive focal length, very popular for its use in documentary and street photography. Its wide angle makes it very suitable for establishing shots to give a whole idea of the location you're at, but it's also great for tighter spaces like narrow streets or markets. It's much more realistic than the ultra-wide angles mentioned earlier, and with its low amount of distortion, it's often used in street photography with a field-of-frame approach. You can play with your framing, placing subjects and different elements all around the frame, making the whole scene multi-layered and more interesting to look at. I personally like using it when I'm shooting in my town and when the weather is great. The light being widely available creates interesting patterns when peeking through buildings, which you can capture with the width of a 28mm. I'd be happy to use a 28mm when traveling or when visiting new places, but I find myself quite uninspired when shooting familiar locations under a grey sky. Everything looks a bit similar, lacking the depth that light can create, and I can't help but thinking that 28mm is too wide in such situations. It's also quite difficult to find simple, clean compositions with a 28mm because of how wide it is, unless you're in a place that is naturally minimal with very low visual noise. I usually pick it up when I decide to shoot with my Ricoh GR3 or with my Sony camera when I'm playing around with the kids, when I go to a new location or shoot locally with good light. 28mm is a typical right in the action, up-close street photography lens. We see many photographers from New York, London and other big cities using a 28mm in busy streets, but I'm less drawn to that style of shooting lately, and there are almost no areas like that in Hiroshima anyway. One last thing about 28mm, I think that in my personal photography journey, it is the focal length that was instrumental for me to get better at composing. Almost 2 years ago now, I committed to using my GR3 exclusively for several months. Since 28mm is wide, you really have to think, try and fail at your compositions if you want to get something nice, and that really fast-tracked my progress. Now talking about 35, and I will also include 40mm in this section because it's gaining in popularity, and 40 is much closer to 35 than it is to 50. So 35 is almost the perfect documentary focal length, whether you're capturing street scenes or your everyday life. It's wide enough to still be considered a wide lens, but you can be more selective in your compositions than with a 28mm. It's an extremely versatile focal length that you can default to in almost any shooting scenario or shooting style. I don't do a lot of them, but I love it for contextual portraits, and I like how you can capture scenes with a 35mm. You can photograph escape, position some still elements or human subjects in the frame, and capture how they interact with each other, making the whole scene interesting to look at. And by the way, when I refer to escape, I'm talking about a landscape, a cityscape, or a streetscape. Similarly to the 28mm, I I like shooting with a 35 when walking in my city and when the weather is good, playing with the light to create patterns, but again, it's a bit difficult for me to use it when it's overcast. When I'm traveling, and regardless of the weather, 35mm is still my go-to lens because it lets me capture larger scenes, but also I can focus more on some details, either natively or by cropping in post. 35 might not be wide enough for some people. It is not tight, but it is true, it's not very wide either. Because of its position between wide and tight, it can also be difficult to compose a clean frame in visually busy environments. 35mm and 40 even more so are very close to how we perceive the world with our eyes, so they can look very normal. You don't have any visual tricks like the compression of tighter lenses or the gigantic effect of ultra-wides. I like to pick it up when exploring new places or shooting casually in my city, ideally with good light. It's also a good lens to bring when hanging out with friends and family, and if I'm going on a trip where photography is not the top priority and I'm only bringing one lens, it's gonna be a 35. 35mm is a fantastic focal length for what it is, and like the 28mm, it's also good for learning and making progress in composition. And as a little bonus, usually 35mm are easy to make small and compact, so it's a perfect everyday lens in every aspect. 50mm is really a focal length that is growing on me. It's starting to get tight, you can focus more on subjects and even some details while keeping a realistic look because the compression you get at 50mm is not excessive. I like how you can approach photography with a process of elimination. It's easier to get rid of undesired elements in the frame, not distract the viewer's attention, and end up with a cleaner, easier to read composition. You can start getting into abstract territory, but it still maintains a certain amount of versatility. In wide open spaces, you will still have a general idea of how the location looks as a whole. All focal lengths will produce nice results in good light, but what I like about 50mm and anything above is how they look in less than ideal light. As I said, you can focus on subjects and details that can even look better in balanced lighting conditions. When going abstract, you can compose and add elements from your environment without being too tied to how good the light looks. 50mm can be a bit limiting, it's not too tight but it's less versatile than 35, and you might find yourself a bit frustrated when visiting new places where you want to capture large and wide frames. That said, I traveled around Japan for 2 weeks once using only a 50mm and I had a very good time. Maybe the nuance is that I was bringing my mom to places I'd been before at least once, so that may have played a role. I love attaching a 50mm to my camera when I'm shooting locally and it's overcast, or when I'm in the mood to capture aesthetically pleasing photos, making images with my environment rather than trying to document unusual events happening around me. 50mm is probably the focal length with which I produced my best looking images so far, but as I said, they are more beauty focused than documentary, and I think it couldn't be my only lens due to its limited versatility. 85mm is the focal length I really started street photography with, or at least what I considered to be street photography at the time. At some point I realized that it was not the best use of an 85mm in the street, so I stopped using it. But anyway, you get more reach and more compression than a 50mm, allowing you to really focus on small details and subjects, but at this distance you lose any sort of connection to them. It's very zoomed in, so it's not ideal for tighter spaces, but you can use it to your advantage, focusing on details or shooting with an abstract approach. It's obviously a good focal length for sports, events or weddings, but that's not my area of expertise. Like the 50mm, and the same goes for any focal length above that, the 85mm performs well in good light, but when it's overcast and I don't feel inspired to shoot at 35 or 28mm, I tend to reach for tighter lenses and play with my environment like a painter would with different colors or brushes. It's a pretty niche focal length, so if you don't use it on the side for weddings or portraits, the use cases for an 85mm can be limited. When do I pick it up? Honestly, I haven't touched my 85mm for more than 18 months because, as I mentioned before, I didn't have the experience and used it for the wrong reasons, staying in my safe place and kind of sniping people from a distance. I can still do that with well-intentioned mind and produce fantastic work, even in the street. I have a growing desire to pick it up again and dedicate more time to using it with a more abstract and detail-driven approach. Long focal lengths are also good for landscapes, so when it becomes more frequent for me to shoot landscapes, I will definitely reach for an 85mm or anything above. I think you get it. It's a lens that is easy to be misused in this TikTok street photography style. Fast and accurate autofocus on modern cameras has made it possible to shoot at f1.8 across the street, nailing your focus without being seen. I've been there and I have done that, so I don't want to be too harsh about it. Do your own experimenting if you want, and if you decide to pick up an 85mm, I'd recommend being selective with where you get your inspiration. With anything from 135mm and above, you really start to get a crazy amount of compression, making all the elements of your frame look closer to each other. You can end up with flatter, painting-like images that can almost look like a different art form than photography. You also get even more reach, letting you focus even more on details. Like the 85mm, these focal lengths are really good for sports, wildlife and events. If you find yourself in a city with long straight streets, you can utilize the compression to get some pretty cool symmetrical shots. As I said before, tighter focal lengths can be a good option when the weather is not that great. We are deep into telephoto territory here, so it's a pretty specialized range of focal lengths. If you have a 2 lenses setup for travel, I can see a nice pairing between a 35mm prime for documentary and scenes and a 70-200 zoom lens for the reach and compression. The only thing is that those telephoto zoom lenses are usually not the lightest, so it depends on your willingness to carry heavy gear and the space in your bag. My opinion on these telephoto focal lengths is similar to what I described for the 85. I think they require a bit more education and should be used in specific cases. I have no intention of getting a 70-200 lens again or buy a 135mm prime, but I have my eye on the Sigma 90mm f2.8. It would serve as both an 85-ish mm and a 135mm when using crop mode. So if I had to choose only one focal length for the rest of my life, it would be a 35mm, and I'm cheating a little bit because I also consider the cropping capabilities of a 35 when paired to a high megapixel sensor camera. A 35mm can be turned into a 52 equivalent when using the APS-C crop mode on my main camera, the Sony a7C II. The resolution is impacted of course, but I've always thought that it is plenty enough to be enjoyed on rather big screens and decent sized prints, because the thing with cropping in, whether it's in post or in camera, is that you are really able to mimic the look of a tighter focal length. Yes, you do lose some bokeh and shallow depth of field capabilities. A 35mm f2 cropped to 52 turns into a 52mm f3. There's a 1.5 factor on both the focal length and the f-stop, but the compression, the perspective and field of view are the same as a native 52mm. But when you try to do the opposite using a 52mm lens, assuming that such lens even exists, and trying to mimic the look of a 35, the only way you can do it is by moving away from your subject. In some situations moving away is not even possible, but if you can, the distance between the camera and the subject is not the same as before, and this is when the compression effect and perspective change. So regardless of how precise you are at trying to make everything look exactly the same, it is literally impossible to have the same look as a 35mm lens with a 52. In summary, 35mm with the APS-C crop mode is equal to 52mm, only the bokeh is affected, but 52mm zoomed out with your feet is not equal to 35mm. We are shifting a little bit, but what we talked about cropping versus zooming makes me want to talk a little bit about the APS-C versus full frame debate. And as we saw, it is totally possible to replicate the look of full frame with an APS-C sensor. If you do your math correctly and the gear that makes a 50mm f2 full frame equivalent actually exists on an APS-C version, you will have the exact same look. So ultimately it comes down to your preferences, whether it's because of a lens lineup, attachment to one brand, or because of weight considerations. There is no right or wrong, there is no better or less good system. We'll end up this video with the never-ending debate of prime versus zoom, and on that topic I may have a little bit of an unusual opinion. If we were living in a world where a 24-70 f2.8 or even f4 was as light and as compact as a prime lens, I would 100% always have such lens attached to my camera. That said, it is not something that I would recommend to everyone, even in this fairy tale world. I have acquired enough experience and knowledge that make me very intentional when I use a zoom lens. For me, it's a set of prime lenses, and I approach every scene or shooting environment with that mindset. I analyze what I have in front of me, picture some potential frames in my head, and only then I decide what focal length I will use. It seems complicated, but with experience it is quite instinctive, and all that happened in a split second. A few years back I couldn't do that, and I made the common mistake of looking through the viewfinder and then zooming in and out very randomly. So here come the prime lenses as of today, and not in this hypothetical world. They are still smaller and lighter than zooms. They are also better optically, so those are obvious benefits associated with using prime lenses, but more so, I think they are good for their educational value. Using a 35mm prime for several months, then switching to a 50mm for another quite long period of time is the way to go if you want to really understand focal lengths and how they impact your images. Maybe you don't have the budget to start collecting prime lenses, or you know that you will feel like you're missing out, out, I get that, so in such situations using a zoom lens from the start is totally fine. My only advice would be to try as much as possible to be intentional with your focal length choice when shooting and also in post. You can filter your photos in Lightroom by focal length to further understand which one you prefer and which one you are more naturally drawn to. But if you have the budget, get yourself a zoom and one prime. I would recommend a 35, 40 or even 50. Use the zoom when you're exploring new places and don't want to be missing out, and when you are doing a more everyday kind of photo walk in your local area, use the prime to make your whole setup smaller and lighter and easier to carry around, so in the end you will take more photos on a day-to-day basis. Okay, so that was a pretty long one. I hope it was helpful and you could find any sort of value into this video. Thanks a lot for watching, and we'll catch up in the next one. Bye.